Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning in this episode, and excited to introduce you to Josh Scott. Josh Scott is the pastor of Grace Point Church in Nashville, Tennessee. And we've just briefly met a couple of times, once at Wild Goose Festival a couple of years ago, and most recently at Theology Beer Camp out in Denver, Colorado, back in October of 2024. And so and I've heard you on a couple of panels, Josh. I've heard you, preach and communicate. And you do a great job, and I also know Stan Mitchell, so so I'm familiar with your church a little bit through Stan primarily.
Yeah,
But so good to have you on the podcast, and thanks for joining us.
thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's got two new books out that we're going to talk about here in a moment. One's called Parables: Putting Jesus' Stories in Their Place. And then the other one is called Cross-Examined: Reading the Bible in Times of Division. So we're going to talk about both of these books in this interview. But before we do that, I always like just getting a little bit of your background, origin story, family. Did you grow up in a faith environment?
Yeah,
Kind of thing.
yeah. So I'm a holler kid. I grew up in a holler in Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, Southwestern West Virginia. That's my stomping grounds. Definitely grew up in a religious household. My grandfather was a Free Will Baptist pastor. And so that's my first 11 years, almost 12 years of life. That's the tradition we were in. After he died, we became liberals and went to a Southern Baptist church where they did wild and crazy things like read from the NIV instead of the King James. And believed in eternal security, which as a teenager was great. Like
Yeah.
getting out of the sort of the paradigm I grew up in, which was you could lose your salvation about as easy as I lose my sunglasses or car keys on a regular basis. And so
Getting saved
those
every
are
Sunday is, you got.
it's emotionally taxing, to say the least. Yeah, no joke. I had trouble sleeping most of my life. It's better now. But I would have to take all kinds of stuff to go to sleep. I just couldn't sleep. And I go to the sleep doctor and he says, "Why do you think you can't sleep?" And I just explain sort of living under the Jesus could come back at any moment or you could die. And if you had unconfessed sins you hadn't dealt with on either of those, you're going to go to hell forever. And so I just lay this whole theological upbringing out. And he just looks at me and just doesn't crack a smile, doesn't do anything. He just looks at me and goes, "Yeah, that'll do it." Um, and then suggested that I also see a therapist in tandem with the sleep doctor. Yeah, that
Oh,
was my
baby.
religious upbringing. And you know what
Wow.
though? Now, I've been in this sort of faith shift deconstruction really since I was probably 11 or 12 years old. So we're looking at 30 years on almost on doing this. And I'm now able to finally come back to my religious upbringing with some gratitude and say, there's a lot of stuff I'm glad I didn't bring with me, a lot of toxic theology, harmful theology even. But also, they gave me a love for the Bible, even though I understand it differently. I'm grateful for that, right? So there seems to be on the other side of a lot of not knowing how to make peace with my upbringing. I'm now able to come back to it a little bit, and at least say something positive
Mm.
occasionally.
Yeah, you bet. Your parents, when you literally went from Free Will Baptist to Southern Baptist, is that right?
Mhm.
And your
Yeah.
parents did that too?
Yeah.
And so
Now,
then,
my dad had been raised more of that way,
uh-huh.
like some version of Baptist that was not as still still really conservative, but not as fundamentalist
Yeah,
as the
yeah.
free will.
So when you were in junior high school, were you in, because we did a bonus content interview just briefly, and you're into sports. Did you play sports
Played
growing
baseball.
up?
Yep.
Okay. What
Played
what
baseball.
position?
Pitcher and shortstop.
And did you go on and play in college?
No, I hurt my shoulder around high school, so that I was, when I was in middle school, I could throw hard and had a curveball. It was great. But then once my shoulder from just, I just our coach didn't manage it very well, and you pitch too much, and you don't take the rest you're supposed to get, and then your arm just like
Yeah.
doesn't have it anymore, which was a bummer.
Yeah. So did you have an experience of feeling called to ministry? I mean, have you been in a pastor career track most of your life?
So watching my grandpa and watching my grandpa be a pastor and deal with church people, I really didn't. It wasn't the career path I was looking for. I thought I was going to be either a professional baseball player, but that didn't happen, or I was going to do something like be a homicide detective or something because I loved those shows as a kid where they would come in and solve the case in 30 minutes or whatever. I thought I could do that. And what happened was I somehow ended up being a leader in this Southern Baptist youth group, even though I was a really shy, introverted kid. And I got asked by the music minister. He said, "Hey, we're doing a youth service on whatever Sunday night, like a month away or 2 months away. And the pastor's out of town. Would you be willing to give a sermonette, just a little short kind of devotional sermon?" And I said, "Yeah, of course," because I also have a chronic people pleasing, like whatever you ask, I'm going to do it. Right? That's how I was as a kid. And so I said yes, and then immediately started praying for the stomach virus because I did not want to get up in front of people and do that. I was terrified. But then I did it, and it was like 11 minutes on John 3:16, content of which I would not stand by today, I am sure. But I just remember thinking at the end of it, I don't know what that was, but I have to do that again. And it was that from that experience, it was like even if I even though I felt like, which is not true, but even if I wanted to do something else, there was nothing else for me to do. Like this was what I was being called to do with my life. And
How old
yeah,
were you?
I think when I gave my first sermon, I was like 16, 15, 16. I mean, as a kid,
I was 16.
why would why would anybody listen? Why in the world would anybody listen to me? I did my first wedding at 19. I'd barely been on a date. Why in the world am I allowed to? You know?
Yeah. Wow. Well, I got saved from drugs and stuff, and then I preached my first sermon at 16. I started smoking weed at 14 and preached my first sermon at 16. So, oh man,
I
yeah,
somehow I didn't have, outside of key moments, I was a pretty straight-laced kid. I would do things like put my friend on the roof of my car and drive as fast as I could in circles. That's more just because apparently I was an idiot. And just didn't know any better. But I didn't try most things teenagers try until I was in my 20s. And yeah, I tried to be a good preacher kid, but again, sometimes you're still a kid.
yeah, yeah. So did you go to college then, right out of high school,
I
and
did,
where
yeah.
did you go?
I started out at a little college near my hometown. It's called Pikeville College. Now it's called University of Pikeville. I did 2 years there, and then I transferred to Eastern Kentucky University, which is not in Eastern Kentucky. And I finished up there. Did a BA in English with an emphasis on writing
Hmm.
because it was easy. I wasn't academically like now. I could go to school for the rest of my life and enjoy it. But when I was actually when I was younger, I was pretty unmotivated and just wanted it to be over with. And English was the easiest thing. I definitely wasn't going to do math. English was just my easiest path to a degree.
Wow. So post college, were you still were you thinking ministry still at this time?
Yeah, yeah. I had about a year of misery doing different things because I pastored a church in college. It didn't end well. It was one of those deals where they're like, "Hey, we want you to revitalize this and bring in young people," and then the young people show up and they're like, "We didn't mean it. We don't want that." Um, and so that ended poorly, and I just kind of spent a year after college working between a coffee shop and paperwork in the billing department of a service department of a Chevy dealership, which was just it was a miserable sort of year. But it also helped me realize actually that I do think that ministry is the thing that I can't imagine anything making me feel as fulfilled
Mhm.
and like I was using whatever skills I have to do something with them that maybe good in the world. And so that year was really clarifying.
So how do you get from there to Grace Point?
You know, some when I was in my early 20s, um, some experiences I had as a kid that when I say my faith started shifting around 11 or 12, like those experiences that rocked my world when I was younger, that I'd sort of pushed behind me and was giving sermons, but I was saying things that I thought, I know this is true, but it's not good. I don't know how it's good. Like I don't know how it's good. And so there was just those little haunting sort of like, is this really how it is? And then somebody gave me a Numa DVD, which was the short films Rob Bell made in the early 2000s.
Sure.
And it brought back my college experience of starting to learn about where the Bible actually came from, and taking religion courses in public university. It just sort of dovetailed and tied all that together. And so when I started, the church I was at before Grace Point was in a little rural Kentucky town, Willow Creek Association Church when I went there. So contemporary, but really conservative theologically. And I got the job there in the middle of my faith deconstruction. I'm in a free fall. I'm spiraling, and I also have to preach on Sunday. And I don't want to say things I can't stand behind, but I do need a paycheck because we just got married. You know what I mean? Like that sort of.
Kind of like where I'm at right now, Josh. I'm no,
It's
I'm
the
just
tension and the terror of wanting to be authentic and also needing to eat, food.
yeah, no.
And so I sort of did my work, my unraveling on the job, and eventually got to the point where I just would start working things in, but eventually just met with our leadership and said, "Look, I know that this may not be the journey of this church, but it's mine, and I have to take it." So here's what I think about atonement theory, LGBTQ include. Like I just went down for our leaders and gave them every possible reason to let me resign. And to their credit, to a person, they all said, "No, we think this is the church's journey too." A year later, like two of them were left. But good on them for at least being up for it a little bit, at least having the conversation. And so by the time I left there in 2019, the church had become affirming and progressive leaning in theology. And that
What kind
was,
of church was it? Just was it just non-denominational,
yeah,
contemporary?
it was it was non-denominational. It emerged out of a Southern Baptist church, but didn't claim, never joined. But it was very much when I went there, that would have been the theological
Okay.
slant for sure.
Okay. Wow. Interesting. Man, that's a hard row to hoe.
You're telling me.
Yeah. Woo.
Yeah.
Lots of rejection there for sure. Well, so then how did you end up at Grace Point then?
Yeah, I've known Stan since about 2014.
Okay.
My church is about an hour and a half away from where
Okay.
Grace Point met at the time.
Yeah.
And just kind of got to know Stan. And then several years later, he reached out and said, "Hey, I'm ready to transition out of the lead pastor role. I'm going to be pastor emeritus. We're hiring somebody, and he said I'm staying out of the process, but I am recommending people they should talk to, and I'd love to recommend you
Hmm.
if you're interested." And he did, and I did, and long story short, my first Sunday at Grace Point was Easter of 2019, which was 6 years ago, 2 weeks ago.
Hmm.
Which looking back on it now, picking Easter to be your first day, mm, it worked out great. But as I was doing it, I thought this may not be a good idea. Like Easter, there's already expectation that you're going to do such XYZ kind of job, and then it's your first Sunday, so there's all that, and but it worked out great, and it has been clearly the right decision for me, and for us to be a part of Grace Point.
That's great. For those listening, if you missed it, I did an interview with Stan, maybe a couple of years ago, but they could go back through my video file and check that out. I, I heard Stan the first time at Wild Goose Festival, and he did that. He shared with he was there with Paula Stone Williams. I didn't know either one of them, and he shared that story about his kids and Santa Claus and tied it into the Joni Mitchell song, and
Yeah.
his whole first second naivety, all that. And
What he does is pretty incredible.
it's such a I was weeping through most of the message, like, and I just don't
Yeah.
cry at messages very often, and so I waited around to talk to him, and ended up getting to know him and stuff like that. But yeah.
And I like to take every chance I can to honor him because, I know I have friends who have gone into situations where they were following a founding pastor and it just went disastrously. And that has not been our experience at Grace Point. Stan has been willing to be helpful in any way he can be, and I've invited him to stay connected. He preaches on a regular basis. We've been very fortunate that he has been a really, really good, dare I say, great pastor emeritus for us. And so I'm just grateful to have him around because I feel like the community benefits from his wisdom and his gifts, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, yeah, you bet. Well, let's jump into your books here. Yeah, so parables. So I I really want to first of all recommend everybody to pick up the book Parables, and I think it's a great resource for pastors who are preaching as well on the parables. And I love some of the you've definitely picked six parables. Three of them deal with kind of domestic life, wineskin, mustard seed, and leaven. And then three of them dealing with kind of economics in some degree and
Yeah.
justice issues, right? The
Yeah.
wicked tenant, the wedding party, and the workers in the vineyard. And you really kind of I mean, like if you grew up in the evangelical world like you and I did, there's these certain ways to interpret those things and I've preached them that way, right? In my
Same.
career. I've been preaching for 40 years. So,
Same.
and you've basically really kind of upended some of those traditional interpretations from the evangelical community. I want to bring out a couple of points that I noticed, and then you kind of bounce off of that. But one of the things that you consistently did just through these six parables in your book was you definitely tackled the anti-Semitic teachings that have gone on in the church. Like the wineskin, let's take for example, so many
Yeah.
people have interpreted that as, Jesus is starting a new religion and the old wineskin is Judaism.
Right.
And all six of these, you pretty much were careful to show how some of these traditional interpretations have literally put Jesus in a situation where he's anti-Jewish almost, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so talk about where did you first see those insights in your journey of how some of the teachings of Jesus were interpreted as anti-Semitic, which is he's a
Yeah.
Jewish guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's
I mean,
teaching the Torah. He's teaching the Torah most of the time, right? Yeah, yeah,
yeah. I mean, partly it was just it was having Jewish friends who, when something would come up, they'd be like, "Do you hear how that sounds? Do you know how that sounds from a Jewish perspective?" No, because I'm a Christian and nobody ever told me I should care what any other perspective thinks about what we're saying. And then it came down to just like doing the work and reading literature and learning, first of all, about anti-Semitism, and how we tend to want to look at the past and say, oh, we overcame that, but it's very obvious in our current moment that we haven't overcome that.
Yeah.
But then the other piece of it was, just learning the context and culture that Jesus lived in, understanding him as a first century Jewish person living under Roman occupation, and realizing that he had a world. I mean, when I was a kid, if you'd have told me that Jesus lived 150 years before I was born in my holler and spoke King James English, I would have just believed you, right? Because that was my context, and all I could see was my context. But then being opened up to the context of the world Jesus lived in, and then going back to some of the traditional interpretations of these parables, specifically the three economic ones I talk about in the book, and just realizing, oh, I don't. But what I know about the context tells me that how we read that cannot be what Jesus would have meant.
Mm.
It just can't be. And then going, okay, so what if that's the case? Then what might be going on here?
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I love those insights. Just I encourage people, read the book, go through those parables, and Josh does a great job of moving those away from an anti-Semitic stance to a very authentic Jewish perspective on life and what Jesus was trying to bring forward about the kingdom, of God in these parables. Second thing I noticed throughout most of them is how Jesus was calling for partnership versus some grand intervention. So like in our open relational process world, we're talking about co-creating, co-partnering with a God of love, uncontrolling love, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I thought you did a beautiful job of talking about the call to partnering with God to bring forth love, beauty, creation, all that stuff versus sort of, withdrawing and praying.
Yeah, yeah.
We got some folks in Kansas City here who, pray real hard for this grand intervention. I don't know if you know about
I
that
know
or
you
not.
do. I know you do. I've heard tell of it.
Anyway, it's, a, it's an insider joke for some of people who are listening. They're going, "What are you talking about?" Anyway, yeah. Oh
Yeah,
boy.
yeah, yeah. And gosh, I think here's one of the things I'll tell people all the time. Uh, you you have to work really hard to make this stuff boring. It's interesting at its core. When I hear somebody give a boring sermon or whatever, I'm like, they work too hard. This is really, really, really interesting on its own. And so being able to come to these stories, being able to engage with these stories, and realizing what I noticed was, and this is thanks to John Dominic Crossan, I got to give him credit, is the difference between Jesus and John the Baptist,
Mm-hmm.
where John is like, it's coming. It's like, get out of the way. God is coming, and God is going to clean house and get rid of the bad guys and bring the kingdom. And then John gets arrested. And it's like then Jesus launches his ministry, but it's like he's done some inventory here and he's asked some hard questions and he's realized, oh, God is not going to just do this. God is looking for partners. And Jesus' kingdom movement is really different than John's. Jesus isn't telling people to prepare in the same way. He's saying, repent, which just means to change your thinking and to trust that the good news that the kingdom is near is true. But he's not saying, stand back, just be blameless and stand back and watch God work. He's saying, okay, everybody bring what you have and we'll gather together. And if everybody brings what they have, we'll have enough food to share with everybody. What if we live together in ways that were just and generous? And then what if that began to spread into the world? I think that's what Jesus is seeing. I think he's seeing a God who's looking for, and I think that is not, that to me is like just taking a look at the sweep of Scripture and seeing that in the beginning of the story in Genesis, you end up God makes stuff and then stops making stuff and says, now you make stuff and you care for the stuff I've made, as if we sort of have that saying, if you want something done right, do it yourself. God doesn't get the memo. Even with Jesus, in John, there's that, he's preparing his disciples and he says, you're going to do greater things than I've done. And, however much of John is literal and historical is a whole other debate. But I do love to imagine the disciples counting the signs on their fingers, going like water to wine, raising the dead, healing the I don't know if we can outdo you. And Jesus' insistence is, no, I'm going to get out of the way. And then it's your turn to do this work. So I think at the core is of our mistakes. One of the big ones with the Christian tradition has been looking at the Christian tradition as a sort of like believe the right things and wait for God to intervene or wait for God to call you to heaven or wait for God to, instead of roll up your sleeves. There's some work to do.
Hmm.
If we want new creation, we're going to have it. We have to have a role in cultivating it.
Yes.
Um, and that has changed how I approach the Bible,
Yeah.
which is also why it takes a lot of work to make this stuff boring, because we're talking about building a different and better world.
Yeah. For sure. Sure. Good stuff. I think though the last three parables you cover, the wicked tenant, wedding party, and workers in the vineyard, are definitely the most radical in terms of how people, especially if you're coming from an evangelical background.
Yeah,
Um, we've always interpreted these three as though the owner or the king or the person throwing the wedding party was God and Jesus,
yep,
and then all the other things that happened were, um, anyway. But dig us. First of
yeah.
all, I'm curious. Where did you first start flipping it and start thinking about how that it might the king or the owner or the one throwing the party wasn't God Jesus, but was maybe a corrupt systemic power
Yeah.
system.
It
Where
started
did
for
you
me.
land on that? I'm curious. And I honestly, I was just reading that. I've read lots of, I've read, I can't tell you how much. I got about 8,000 books right here around me right now. And yeah, yeah, this is fun stuff.
Yeah.
You
Well, I
really
wish I could
flipped the
say,
script, and I love the way you challenge people to think. Well, is this really the God of violence that we're serving, and how can that fit? And does
yeah,
that, all that stuff. So you really did a great job of getting us to rethink these parables. But I was curious your
yeah,
own rethinking of them. How
yeah.
did you come across that?
And not everybody likes it.
I know.
Brad on Amazon gave it a 1-star review and said, "This is garbage. Stick with the Bible." So, so first of all, it started for me with, and this is a parable I actually treat in my first book, which is called Bible Stories for Grown-ups: Reading Scripture with New Eyes. Um, and it's the parable of the talents. It was, I was, the traditional interpretation of that had been sort of the use it or lose it. God's going to judge you according to what you've done with what God's given you, right? Did you take your talents and do something with them, or did you not? And so the bad guy is the guy who buries it. And I just began to realize there's a lot going on in that story that just didn't make sense to me. Like when the quote unquote wicked lazy servant who just buried the talent instead of multiplying it says to the owner of the talent, "I knew that you're a harsh, irrationally man. You reap what you didn't sow. You take what you want." And the man doesn't, like. I'm just thinking, if somebody said that to me, like, "I knew you were this way," I would say, "Oh my gosh, that's what you think of me? That's who I am in the world? Oh my goodness." That's not what happens in the parable. The guy's like, "Yeah, that's exactly who I am. So why in the world wouldn't you have done?" And it's just like, that doesn't seem very godlike to me. That doesn't seem to be the God Jesus is talking about. The God of compassion, the God who cares about the birds and the flowers and us. That did not match. It's almost like Jesus has this beautiful vision of God, but then when he's going to tell a story, he's like, "That's out the window, and now we're going to have this mean, violent, and vindictive God." And I just started thinking, gosh, what if the wealthy, powerful people in the story, in a story like this, are representative of the wealthy, powerful people in Jesus' world? And what if Jesus is explaining something through these stories about the kingdom of God and the resistance it will meet as it tries to bring about a different world? And then I found a guy named William Herzog II, who wrote some books, and he has one I think called "Parables as Subversive Speech." And then there are a couple others. I think that's Herzog. Anyway, and I started reading
I'm
some
I'm the kind of
scholars.
guy that will chase that reference down.
You should. It's
Gosh,
it's
because I don't know
great.
that reference. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
it's a great book, really helpful. And then I stumbled on a couple others where I started seeing there were other people way before I noticed it who had way more flesh on the bone of this idea, that was really helpful in, being able to take it to other parables and see how it functions similarly in all these stories. We end up naming God as the powerful figure, or at least in Matthew, Jesus says, if you want to find me, don't look for the powerful, look for the forgotten, the marginal, the oppressed, the prisoner. Find me there. And then we're like, oh no, the most powerful, the person who's doing really well in the economic system, that has to be the God character, the Christ figure. And I think what it actually is most of the time is it's the empire figure.
Mm.
And Jesus is the one in the parable bearing the brunt of the empire's wrath, which explain. I mean, when he tells the parable of the talents in Luke's version, it's the parable of the minas, but it happens like on Palm Sunday as they're going to Jerusalem, and they think the kingdom is about to come at any moment, and Jesus tells them the story of the talents.
Mm.
Not because he's trying to say it's going to be a long time, but then I'm going to come back and you better be ready, as a way of saying, we're going to take this protest movement to Jerusalem, and the empires are not going to take it kindly. And empires are going to do what empires are going to do. And I will be thrown out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And there's this really, last thing I'll say, there's this really interesting juxtaposition between the third servant in that story of the talents, who, when being questioned, finally says nothing. He's speechless. To Jesus standing before Pilate, saying nothing,
Mm.
speechless.
Mm.
And if that's Matthew, well done, buddy.
Mm.
Yeah, you really created quite the juxtaposition with those two characters.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight. Even in your wedding party uh, parable that you did in your parable book, you're suggesting that Jesus is the one who's improperly dressed, and
Yeah,
Jesus is the one who's being thrown out into the weeping gnashing of teeth.
yeah, because he refuses to play ball. He refuse. I think one of the most misunderstood interactions, I think, in the Gospels is the whole render unto Caesar bit, as if what we're being given there is a really good separation of church and state, like that whole discussion. When I think what Jesus, I love that when they ask him, do we pay taxes? He's like, I don't have a coin. I don't carry that. I don't participate in that system. Those of you who have a coin, let's see it. Oh, whose image is that? Hmm. It's just
And it's
fascinating to me.
some of the corrupt some of the people that had co-opted with Rome's system of oppression that were
They
carrying
got coins.
they're carrying the
Jesus doesn't
emperor's
have coins.
horns. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
I
think
think I
I
think
think
one of the core messages is that Jesus is opting out of the system.
mm,
And I think that's what, we don't, I don't do that. We just share our stuff over here. We're building a better humanity, one where what's in your pocket doesn't define your worth and value. And that if you don't have enough, we'll make sure you do. And that's a challenge to the power and success of empire, because if that's successful and a movement like that begins to get traction, you have very little chance at destroying it, because these people can't be, you can't kill enough of them to make them go away. So you better find out a way to co-opt it.
mm,
And turns out Rome was pretty good
mm,
at co-opting.
yeah, yeah. I some of these, when I read Dominic Crossan's The Last Week, his book,
Hmm.
The Last Week, is that the title? I can't remember.
It is, yeah. He wrote that with Borg.
Or yeah, Marcus Borg.
Amazing book.
And yeah, the first time I dug through that, the insights that I thought were so rich just started popping with me, right? And so that was probably the first time that I started reading that whole Last Week through the lens of empire
Yeah.
versus my evangelical lens. Who the other people that you referenced, Herzog,
Hmm.
where is he?
William Herzog.
Is that a contemporary guy or an older?
No, he's an older theologian.
Okay.
I
I'm just
don't know
curious.
actually. I don't
I'm enough
know.
of a nerd. I chase these things down, so.
And the way I ended up finding him, I think, was through. I think I'd reached out to Brian McLaren and just said, "Hey, can I run this by you? And do you know anybody else who's
Mm,
remotely?" And he mentioned Herzog to me,
okay.
and that's how I ended up stumbling on him. And he has several works that are really helpful. I think it's Parables as Subversive Speech was the first one, maybe.
Cool. All right. Well, let's jump. We've got a little bit of time left. Let's jump into the second book because both these books just came out, right, in the last few months. Is that right?
Parables was in February, and Cross Examined was in April.
April,
Yeah,
yeah. So cross-examined, reading the Bible in times of division. And the intro there, you're just talking about kind of, really, isn't it crazy how we grew up in this evangelical, which is like supposed to be good news. And I grew up Billy Graham, preached the gospel
yeah,
kind of thing, and I still love good news. I still love grace. I love Jesus, all that stuff. But it isn't interesting how when people who have been hurt by the church, whether it be women, people in the LGBTQ plus community, um, people of color, historically marginalized people in America, maybe um, indigenous people, it's been the Bible, the use of the Bible, that has been the source of the hurt, and the way the Bible has been weaponized against communities that, if you read Jesus was the one that was for these people, right? And then
yeah,
here we're taking the Bible and weaponizing it against the very people that Jesus seemed to be the most for,
yeah,
if you will.
yeah.
So you just kind of hit that straight on and started, tackling. The first one you did was gender equality. Um, I when I planted my Vineyard Church, there's some things that like today. I pastored that church for almost 30 years, and there's some things I'm still very proud of, but then there's some things I cringe about, right? But I did have
Mhm.
female pastors from the very beginning. So we were,
Yeah.
I was a little on the progressive evangelical side of things, but gender equality, give us some insight into where I want to hit these LGBTQ, white Christian nationalism, and racism.
Yeah.
Gender equality seems to be the one that's the easiest to help evangelicals think through, even though you've got some people that are still banging on the
Yeah.
women need to be quiet kind of stuff and all
I
that.
was gonna say, except Southern Baptist,
Except Southern,
because
right?
in recent years, my
I mean,
siblings
when Rick
have
Warren
been,
leaves Southern Baptist because of the women issue, you're like, huh?
yeah. But and I can remember what I was just having a conversation with somebody about this today. Just sort of this understanding in the churches I grew up in, which was women, they can't lead, they can't preach. What they can do is any of the stuff the men don't want to do, which is usually running the church in some way, whether it's managing the potluck, leading the children's ministry, whatever the men in power didn't want to do, women could do. And so if you take some of their theology, though, they're bending their own theology to make that happen, which means that there's something that I think at the root of so many of our problems, whether it's LGBTQ plus inclusion, especially, is rooted in misogyny.
Hmm.
And I can remember in the church I pastored before Grace Point, I had been preaching for years about egalitarianism and how in the kingdom of God there is no male or female, right? Like that's that line in Paul. And I finally asked somebody, how come every year when we nominate elders, a woman never gets nominated? I've been there several years at this point, and they're like, we have a statement that says they can't. Like, so I've been preaching all this egalitarianism, and nobody thought to tell me, oh yeah, there's this statement in the back of the doctrinal belief section that says women can't lead in that way. And so I ended up doing a series wrestling with scripture around that. And then, we had to do a church vote to repeal that statement and then become truly egalitarian in our leadership model. it passed like 96%. But it was really interesting to me that people left for two reasons. One is because they thought we were bending disobeying the Bible. The second was, I remember one of the people who was so angry about the decision to do this was a woman. And I kept meeting with her, kept talking to her, and just couldn't get her to see. And I even said at one point, like, you realize based on your theology, you shouldn't be talking to me. You should talk to your husband, and your husband should talk to me. But we're not even doing that. We're talking to each other. Don't you see that this is? And she said, deep down, here's what I'm concerned about. Not only women in leadership, but I know the next thing you're going to do is you're going to try to affirm gay people.
Mm. Mm.
I said, well, yeah, you're right. Cards on the table. That's the next thing. Yeah. And so it's just how rooted a lot of our phobias and bigotries and refusals to move forward are rooted in similar soil.
Interesting.
And so, coming out of a background where you didn't get to see women lead and preach, um, it's being able to do that to me is just so enriching and good for the church and uh,
For sure.
long overdue for Southern Baptists. Come on, friends.
For sure. Yeah. I have, it's hard for me not to comment here because, I went to Baylor and Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. And then I did a D-Min at Fuller, and studied with Peter Wagner while I was there, which for the progressive crowd, oh my gosh, all kinds of trigger things there for the progressive crowd. Right. But then I wanted to do I wanted to work on a Hebrew PhD, and two of the professors at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is 15 minutes from me right now, which is one of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries, two of them had graduated from HUC in Cincinnati, which is one of the premier rabbinic training schools, and they did their PhD with Jewish professors who were, who were relatively progressive Jewish professors and brilliant in Hebrew. And I studied with those two guys, and I actually loved it, and they were wonderful to work with, and had, spent their whole academic world training with pretty progressive Jewish rabbi professors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it was so funny because I had women pastors, and they called me a British evangelical, which was their nice way of saying, yeah, you're not us, but we kind of still
Right.
count you in a little bit.
Yeah.
But the funny thing was when I was there, and they don't have this now, but they had a woman teaching archaeology of the Bible at one of the classes at Midwestern. And I remember asking the guys there, I said, so how does this work with, your ban on women can't teach men? Well, and their explanation was, well, she's not teaching the Bible. She's teaching archaeology. And I was like, oh.
Which informs how you understand the so close.
Just like, all right. But now I don't even think they have women teaching archaeology of the Bible there after this big vote they had a couple of years ago. Anyway, but how about then? Golly, there's so much. Where did you start thinking about the LGBTQ plus issue in your own journey? How did that start shifting for you?
I wish there was a great story. The heavens parted, an angel came down with a scroll and said, it really came down to just having friends who I'd known and done worked with and just known for years. And I knew they loved God and I knew they were trying to follow Jesus like I was, who started coming out to me
Mm.
and just feeling in my gut. I just want them to be happy. I want for them all the same things I would want for me. And then realizing, I've got to go back and reread the Bible. Because that's usually how the movement of something works, right? I think it's our heart often will lead us,
Mm.
and then our head has to make sense of it, right? It's Peter having the vision in Acts 10 where the scroll's let down and saying, "Oh, I can't do that. I've never eaten anything unclean." And God's like, "Who said it was unclean? I call it clean, right?" Just that, and then having to go and re-wrestle with the Bible as a result of it. And so that was my experience. going back to the Bible and realizing that maybe some of the ways we've been taught to read the Bible were wrong, really harmful. And then beyond that, just the fact that what we're talking about today, when we talk about human sexuality, was not a category or anything they would have possibly had in their brains in the ancient world. And so that was helpful, but it really started as sort of what I think now is, a holy moment where God was inviting me to change my mind.
Yeah.
Um, Not forcing me, but inviting me.
Yeah.
Good, open, and relational theology.
Yeah. The podcast interview I did before you was with Brian McLaren. I mean, I'm sorry,
Well,
Brian Ellison. Sorry.
mm,
I have interviewed Brian McLaren, but Brian Ellison, who is the executive director of the Covenant Network of Covenant, yeah, Covenant Network of Presbyterians. And he's a Princeton Harvard grad, and we were colleagues. He was pastor in the Presbyterian Church. I was pastor in the Vineyard Church. We were friends, but he was single and gay, but hadn't come out. And then 2012, he came out, resigned from his church that he'd done a great job at here, just 10 minutes from me right now, and became the executive director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, helping PCUSA churches
mhm.
come open and affirming. Basically, he's been doing that for the last 12 years.
Well,
But yeah, when we met, he would have been afraid to tell me because I was in a more conservative setting and more conservative church, even though we had dinner together, went to Royals games together, all that kind of
mm,
stuff. And, it's people like Brian, and I was pastoring people in my church, and I've been open. When I first started the church, I thought, well, homosexuality is a sin, but it's not a sin any different than mine. And so I need grace, they need grace, we all need grace. And so I was always a grace guy, right? But I didn't realize how that welcome and not affirming and trying to call sexual orientation or who you love a sin actually
yeah.
was damaging. So it was like a welcome trap to the LGBTQ people because we really weren't as loving as we pretended to be, right? And we were actually doing damage to people. So yeah, same for me. I would just have friends like Brian and then people in my congregation who were trying to pray
Yep.
the gay away because they'd become from these conservative backgrounds. And then, 10
Yeah.
years later, are trying to pray the gay away. They're 1% less gay and they hate themselves more. And they, become suicidal even. And I'm like going, this just can't, these people love God. They're some of the most beautiful people on the planet.
Yeah.
This just can't be, so I was the same way. I started rereading those passages, and you kind of in your book just tackle all 6 of those clobber passages
Hmm.
that we call. I like that. What about white Christian nationalism? That's wow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
such a
mean,
massive issue right now in our culture, and with our current administration, it's just holy crap.
yeah. I think that's the only thing you can say. Holy crap. Um,
It's like,
it, it was just writing that chapter and reliving in my brain everything that we witnessed on January 6th, 2021. Just unbelievable that we're here, but also in some ways it's tracked. I mean, this has been the long game of the Christian nationalist folks, which was while we thought, oh gosh, we're moving farther away from that kind of ideology, they were just biding their time. And I think it's maybe maybe the most dangerous doctrine right now is this idea that Christian nationalism is espousing. And so being able to write a chapter that just sort of says, here's what it is. And I leaned on Jamar Tisby's definition of Christian nationalism in the book because I thought it was so good and insightful. And just being like, this is one of those things like you remember that line in one of the pastoral letters where the writer says they have a form of godliness but deny its power. People on the outside who don't know very much about it may look at it and go, "Oh yeah, that's Christianity," and it is a form of Christianity. But I think it's so far away from Jesus and what Jesus was actually up to in the world. It's succumbing to the temptations that Jesus resisted,
hmm,
which is we bring in a Christian empire.
Hmm.
That's not what Jesus was.
Right.
Jesus was not trying to bring a different version of Rome. He was
Right.
trying to invite us into a different way of being human together, which is radically different.
He wasn't trying to bring in a different version of Pharaoh
Right. Or
or Rome
Caesar or Herod or
or any of
any
those.
of them.
Yeah. Here this is interesting. When I was at Southwestern Baptist Seminary in the 80s, this was before the conservative takeover. So I actually had professors that were, you know, pretty moderate, like they weren't inerrantists. And one of
Right.
my professors was a guy named William Estep who taught church history. And he was at the time considered one of the foremost Anabaptist historians in the world.
Well,
Even he
well,
was teaching at Southwestern Baptist Theology. He wrote a history of the Anabaptists called The Anabaptist Story. He translated the Schleitheim Confessions. He wrote a biography on Balthasar Hubmaier, the very famous Anabaptist theologian. He's written several church history books on the Reformation. And he wanted me to do PhD work with him, and I was more the evangelist and church planner kind of person. But I took all of his classes, and you know, from Constantine till the Reformation, you basically had Christian empire, Christian dictatorship, union of church and state, magisterial. You know, that was the form of Christianity that spread around the world.
yeah,
And when the Reformation hit, you have Lutherans wanting to kill Church of England people, and you want Calvin wanting to kill Michael Servetus because he disagrees on the Trinity, and you had Christians killing Christians because if you disagreed with the doctrines of the state, it was like committing treason against the state
yeah,
because the church and the state were wedded, so doctrine and the state were wedded. So if you disagreed with the doctrines, you get, like Galileo, you get put in
yep,
prison or you get killed or you get ostracized. And I thought, the Anabaptists studied under Zwingli and they baptized each other by immersion. They broke the ice out there on the Lamont River, and within 2 years, all George Blaurock, Felix Mons, Conrad Grable, they were all martyred because they believer baptized each other. One of
yeah,
them, they tied rocks on him and sunk him in the river where they baptized each other. Because they believed in believers baptized, they were killed by Christians.
yeah,
Christians killing Christians in the name of Jesus. And so the Anabaptists got killed by all the Christians, and
yeah,
they're the only ones that took Jesus seriously in terms of love your
right,
enemies. And
yeah,
they're the ones that came up with a Christian version of separation of church and state. Now, to me, it was a little bit too withdrawal oriented, right?
sure,
But this is a message. This is crazy to me that we've got Christians in America who are buying into Christian empire in the name of Jesus. It, I'm, I'm just like, how do we get this message out there?
I know,
I mean, we got Vote Common
yeah,
Good guys. We've got so many people that are trying to date. I thought Gushy's book was great. Saving
hmm
democracy against its Christian enemy kind of thing. But how do we reverse the tide of this thing? Like, wow.
yeah. It's
Wow.
it's not easy.
I
It's not going
appreciate
to be
your
easy.
voice. I appreciate your voice in this. I think we just got to all start making as much noise as we can. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's a
and
bizarre thing.
I keep saying to people, it is a marathon, not a sprint, because these problems did not emerge overnight, and they're not going to be dealt with overnight. It's going to take resolve, resilience, commitment, refusing to let fear dictate. What you see in a lot of things right now is President of the United States threatens to use the power of government against a law firm, which is utterly insane, and they just capitulate to him. We need people who are willing to bear the consequences of saying no to this administration and to Christian nationalism as a whole, knowing that there will be consequences for that. That they're not going to say, no empire has ever said, "Oh, thank you for rejecting my message." They tend to crucify you,
Yeah.
and so, I think it is we need a dogged stubborn resilience
Mm,
uh, to keep saying, I know I sound like a broken record, but this ain't it.
mm.
And this this isn't good news. And it's definitely not good news for everybody. And if it's not good news for everybody, then it may be religious, it may be doctrine, but it ain't gospel.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Have you read the book called Opus by chance?
Hmm, don't
Um,
think so.
the guys that authored Project 2025, which is basically a Christian dictator document, Christian
Mhm.
nationalist document, wanting to tear down the separation of church and state and literally build a union of church and state in America, like against the Constitution, basically.
Yeah.
And the two groups that wrote that, one was a conservative Catholic group called Opus Dei, which a
Okay.
couple of our Supreme Court justices, I think, um, were influenced by. And then the founder of the the new Apostolic Reformation, Peter Wagner, who I knew and studied with at Fuller, which I don't think he would have wanted to take what he was doing in the direction that his followers have taken it into Christian
Mhm.
nationalism. But anyway, he's considered the founder. So the dude that also authored it on the evangelical side is a Wheaton grad, the Project 2025, and he would be associated with this new Apostolic Reformation group as well. So you've got these conservative Catholic, conservative evangelicals, same group that rallied around Reagan, uh, that has now you know developed this whole strategy to basically build a authoritarian president who doesn't answer to any other the division of the Constitution, either the judicial or the executive. I mean, or the legislative branch of the government. So it's a serious attack on the foundations of America, let alone the gospel, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean, we're currently at the time of this recording, there's still been a unanimous Supreme Court ruling that has not been followed by this administration, and nobody's really talking about it.
9-0, bring the dude back.
And he's still not here.
Yeah, and
And we're not talking like why we should all be running around screaming. You know, like
yeah,
this. You want to talk about how democracy dies in the daylight? It's when they're, but they also, the Supreme Court kind of set itself up when it basically said presidents are above the law.
yeah, that was a horrible decision.
Because what now do
Yeah,
you do to him? Well, they
right.
can say, well, you can impeach him. Well, yeah, but you also have Congress in the hands of people who are sycophants for Trump and who will never push back and will never
Yeah.
tell him no. And so, I mean, this feels like worst case scenario. Like he won and he got the branches of government that are, going to support him.
Hmm.
It's a scary time
Yeah.
for democracy.
Yeah, I think democracy's on the line for sure. And I think educate, who most people don't know anything about the Reformation or church history or the Anabaptist tradition, and why the Anabaptist tradition in the beginning of American history, when people were fleeing persecution, Christians killing Christians in Europe, and why would a bunch of Christians vote and build a constitution with a separation and side with liberal democracy like John Locke? Why would they do
Mm.
that? It's because they understood the atrocities of Christian nationalism and how that's totally anti-Jesus. I mean,
Yeah.
there is that stream that was back there behind the Constitution that was a part of the Christian stream that I think is the truer Jesus stream of the whole thing, right? That's the ones that laid down their life and wanted to love their enemies versus trying to gain power and kill their enemies. So,
Mm. Yeah.
ugh. Well, Josh, man, thank you for your work. Thank you for your books. I love what you're doing, and I appreciate your heart for pastoring too, because
Mm.
I've been doing that for about 40 years, and it's not the easiest road. People think we just work once a week, and
Yeah. Yeah.
ah,
Maybe twice a week during Holy Week.
yeah,
You,
yeah,
you got to get your money's worth.
right.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation. And, I think more and more, I totally get why folks are opting out of ministry and opting out of church. I think there's something good still here. And I think there are a lot of people who are walking around with grief because they feel like their faith and their scriptures have been taken away from them. And I think that there are ways of approaching all this that give it back in non-toxic, non-harmful ways that actually work toward human flourishing, which I think if anything is good news, it's working toward flourishing.
Yeah. I'm in agreement. I mean, even from an evolutionary perspective, all species thrive better together. It's not just survival of the fittest, it's survival of the friendliest, as Frank
Yeah,
Schaeffer likes to say. And and I think that can be meditation communities, church communities, synagogue
absolutely.
communities, mosques, you know, I mean, there's all kinds of communities if we if we commit to love and helping
Yeah,
all species thrive in love, we're going down a good path, I think. So people need each
exactly.
other. We don't we thrive
Exactly.
better together, you know. So appreciate your commitment to the church at this point too. It's a tough one, I know, but I've struggled with it myself, but I'm still there. So thanks so much. Tell people how they can, you know, you can go on Amazon and just type in Josh Scott, and you've got 3 books out there.
4.
Context, oh, 4, sorry. Context,
Yep.
The Parables, Cross-Examined, and I missed
And Bible stories for grown-ups.
Bible Stories for Grownups.
That was
And
my
then is
first.
there the church website? Do you want to give that or your personal
Sure.
website?
Yeah, so I've got a few, Grace Point, if you wanna find out about our church, listen to sermons, that's gracepoint.net, and Grace Point has an E on the end, so it's like gracepointy.net. And then I had 2 sites. One is my Substack blog, and that's, joshscott.online. So currently, I don't charge for subscriptions. That may change someday, but right now I don't. So if you'd like to subscribe, make sure you get what I'm writing about. And then my other site is joshscott.co, co, and that's where you can just find out more about my work. There's a page you can invite me to speak. I do lots of stuff on Zoom with churches that are reading my books. Do stuff in person when they ask. So those are the best ways to find me.
Excellent. Well, hey, thank you for being on Spirituality Adventures. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.